So welcome everyone, and thanks for enduring. My name is Omar Dewachi. I'm at the Faculty of Health Sciences at AUB, and I've been really delighted being also one of the co-organizers of this conference. I'm really delighted. It's been really amazing 2 days, and this is the kind of the big bang at the end. Hopefully, with everyone is kind of participating in this round. Hopefully, this straight table with a round seating. So I think one of the interesting things for me that came out of the conference is more opening up the idea of a closed, bounded space for a civil society. I think what we have seen is really presentations about different contexts and the linkages between them and the specificities of different places, and maybe we can begin to think about civil constellations of civil society and more like assemblages of civil society and their connections from different places. And I think a lot of the themes questioned and critiqued the discourses around civil society, but also try to give alternative, and that's a word that I heard a lot today and the last couple of days, alternative ways of thinking about the classical way of understanding civil society. And I think there was a lot of substance, another word that I just heard. And I think what I want to do as a moderator is to probably get the keynote speakers, including our Provost, Ahmad Dallal, to maybe speak each for 5 minutes, collecting some of the emerging themes, contradictions, maybe think about strategies, tactics, technologies that kind of could help us in putting together ideas that came out of this conference. The other thing that I would like to ask people to do within this limited time is to think about what is the next step. How would something like the Asfari Institute, just starting right now at AUB, how would the vision of the institute could correlate more with a kind of a new way of thinking about civil society and citizenship? So and in a more of a practical way, where is this heading? How does it shape in the future? So I think these are kind of crucial questions, and I don't want to take too much time. And we will start with Dr. Rashid Khalidi, because I know he's in a hurry.
اعتذاري للجميع. I'm really sorry, and it's no disrespect to this extraordinary audience or to my gifted colleagues on the panel. I'm very sorry that I have to go in the middle of this. I want to thank everybody who organized this. I want to thank the people who had the patience to sit through 2 days of it. If I have a small tip to the organizers and to the organizers of any conference ever in the future, things begin on time, things end on time. People can talk in the corridors. They don't have to have microphones in their hands. The questions are the best part of a thing, but a lot of that can take place in the corridors. The only thing I want to say to you as in conclusion is that I myself learned an enormous amount from what I heard over these 2 days. يعني أنا متابع الثورة العربية أو الثورات العربية أو الانتفاضات العربية منذ البداية. مش عن كثب، لأن أنا خارج المنطقة. إنما اللي تعلمته خلال هاليومين فعلا كان مفيد جدا. بدي أشكر كل المشاركين وكل اللي طرحوا أسئلة، لأنه الحقيقة يعني كانت معلومات وتحاليل قيمة جدا. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that in a certain sense, I really do not belong here in this conference. In a certain sense, I suppose I do, and Khaled belongs here more than I do, even though he is also a historian. I'm a historian. I'm not a social scientist. I don't study what's going on, and I'm not really an activist. I mean, I make trouble, but I'm not really an activist in my own field. And as a historian, it's impossible for me to tell you what's happening, because that's not what we do. What I and my colleagues and my students will try to do is to make sense of what you and others, the others in الميدان يعني, are doing and our writing and our tweeting and our filming and our doing, probably not in traditional journals, it'll be in forms that I cannot even imagine by 5 or 10 years from now. And try and put it in context and make sense of it. But we'll do that later, because this is an ongoing affair. Now, there are a few people, Marx could write things in 1848 that we can still read today and say, this is good contemporary history. None of us is Marx. I mean, I certainly don't think any of us is Karl Marx. Ibn Khaldun could be lowered in a basket from the side of the wall of Damascus and meet Hulagu and leave us an account of the siege, which you can still read today, 600 years later, to great. But none of us is Ibn Khaldun. In fact, somebody accused me I mentioned this in a recent acknowledgments of a book, that none of us is Ibn Khaldun. Somebody said, you're trying to compare yourself to Ibn Khaldun. I am not trying to compare myself to Karl Marx, and I'm not trying to compare myself to Ibn Khaldun. So there are a few exceptional observers who are truly historians and who can say something intelligent and interesting about the present. I don't think that's what I can really do, or serious historians can really do. We can do the kind of thing that Khaled is trying to do in Egypt, which is to to archive and record and set down as best can be done what can be archived of an ongoing upheaval that is of world historical importance. What is happening, any moron can tell you this, but as a historian, if you want a certification of it, this is a world historical experience, okay? You can take it from me. You can say, Rashid Khalidi said on the 24th of whatever, May, so-and-so. But what it really means and where it will go, Allahu A'lam. Nobody knows, of course. We will one day be able to do that. But the more interesting thing is what the real social scientists, the real activists, the real people who are engaged in the politics and the social change and the activism that we've heard about here will do and will write and will tweet and will use as means of struggle. I mean, that's the interesting. I can't say anything about that. So that's really all I have to say. Thank you.
It's very difficult to come up with, as I said yesterday, with a narrative of what is happening or an understanding of what is happening. For me, in particular, it is even more difficult because I'm living it, and I'm very like Karima active. I mean, I teach, and part of my teaching is about this. I write a weekly article, and all my writings is trying to make sense and to keep my sanity, to get my frustration out. I am an activist. I'm a member of many organizations and initiatives that have sprung out of the revolution that are really, really exhilarating. The ones that I care about is the one that I want to share a minute with you about the freedom of information law and the problems we encountered in it, and the archives law. But there are many other initiatives. But really the most exhilarating thing is just being on the street. There is something fascinating. It's not only the 18 days, the famous nostalgic 18 days, but we've had many days, and these are the conversations one engages in, the conversations one overhears, the activity, the enthusiasm, but also sadly the suffering and the bloodshed and the I mean, you see history in the making. I mean, one can go on, but there's nothing, and as I said yesterday, there's nothing in my experience that actually has prepared me for this. And then my challenge is to try and listen to what is happening, and to learn and to unlearn and to learn things. So I want to end with a story that I want to share with you. I think the most exhilarating, most eventful 48 hours of the revolution, not in the beginning, in the middle. Karima knows part of it because she was with me in it. And it is to relate to what we have been talking here, especially regarding the NGOization argument and the youth dimension. I wish we had touched on Islam, which we haven't, which I think is a significant omission in this conference, and the question of identity. And I usually associate both together. Islamism and identity have been conspicuously absent from our discussions today. They're very much present in Egypt, and they're very much, in my mind, muddling and the waters and distorting the vision. The story that I want to share with you is to just tell you what the kind of engagements one finds oneself in. It's a Saturday morning. I was minding my business. It's a weekend. I want to catch up. And then I hear from Karima and a common friend that actually we have to go. I mean, that there is an event that is happening, which is the murder of a very important activist who was active in the Midan, in the square, distributing food. He's a Sheikh Ahmad Aifat, an Azhari prominent scholar, young, popular in the square, and he was murdered, and suspicion is that he was murdered with a sniper. So his body is in the Cairo morgue, and we will go to in solidarity and, you know, to see the funeral and to participate in it. Now, this is the second time for me to go to the morgue in Cairo, which is not what I do. I mean, I'm a historian, I don't go to morgues, but this is what we find ourselves doing. So we go to the morgue and we see some horrific scenes of families, his family, families of other victims, and then we march with the body. I mean, we go by car to the Al-Azhar, where the funeral is supposed to go. And we're waiting, the Mufti himself is leading the prayer, the funeral prayers. We're waiting to see what he's going to say about the cause of death. Is it an act of God or is it an act of the government? And when he said it's an act of God, it was the women who started shouting him down. And the funeral turned into a demonstration, and we marched really halfway across the city, from Al-Azhar to the funeral, to the family burial grounds, and we buried him. Then we hear there's a fire in the Institute d'Egypte in front of AUC, and you know, why don't we pass by Tahrir? All of this is in Tahrir, to see what is happening. I go there and I see these young kids who later on would be accused for setting fire to the Institute d'Egypte, actually bracing the fire, going into the inferno to save whatever manuscripts or ancient books that they could save, and paradoxically hand them over to military police, the last people to be thought of as custodians of culture or art or ancient books. I spent the night there, and a friend of mine, a crazy guy who insists on going and saving books. I said, you know, Ahmad, the library is lost and the building is very unsafe, and I go home, sleep for a couple of hours. He's still there. I follow up. I go there the following day. I'm drenched finally. By the way, the Cairo fire brigade is literally 20 meters away. It comes like 12 hours later to put up the fire. And it doesn't put out the fire. It drenches us, demonstrators and activists, and intentionally. And we're, I mean, I'm drenched. It's cold. It's December, so I stand up in the sun to dry myself, and I see this woman passing by and coming, and our eyes catch each other. And then she passes me, and she turns back, and she said, you know, I've seen you before. I've seen you. Weren't you on TV the other day talking about the Muhammad Mahmoud incidents, and that you were there and people were asking you why you were there? And I said, yes, it was me. And she said, well, I'm asking you again, why are you here? What brings you here? So I said, you know, I'll answer you exactly what I answered the young kids on Muhammad Mahmoud. What brings you here? So, you know, what brings you here? She said, well, my son is here. And she just said, you know, pointed out to the Midan. And I said, where? She said, he's doing, I don't know. How old? He said, 15. So why is he here? She said, well, his best friend was killed in Muhammad Mahmoud. And he said, Mom, I'm not coming back home before I get his right back. And she left, just like that. And I think that gesture, like the kids that I saw a week earlier on Muhammad Mahmoud and asked them, why are you here? And they didn't even say anything. They just pointed to Wizrat al-Dakhliya, the Ministry of Interior. And I think that's my cause. You know, my enemy is, as I said yesterday, it's the torture that is continuing to be practiced. I'll end with what I ended with that same day. As I said, it was the most remarkable 48 hours. We go then, you know, with the same wet clothes to the Council of Ministers, to the Cabinet, to discuss with the activists that Karim has been talking about a new draft law for the freedom of information. And it's an ongoing thing. It's like the umpteenth meeting we meet, and the security people are not there, but everybody knows that we're talking about security and that the security will never let go of anything in any government ministry. But then it's this youth. It's people in their 20s, maximum 28, 29, the Gharbeya brothers, Ahmad Khair. These are people who founded these organizations, these NGOs that I've heard many people dismiss them. They are doing amazing work. They've accumulated so much experience, so much language. They've done their homework. They were the ones who were ready. They may or may not have triggered it, but they were very ready to seize the opening in the political scene. And the guy, the interlocutor, is a kind of on our side, a minister on our side, and saying, look, you know, what you're saying is wonderful, but I'm a statistician. The chances of what you're drafting ever passing through any of the levels that we have to pass through to get this law out is nil. So Gharbeya responds by saying, but this is exactly why we're not statisticians. So we laugh, and then he says, okay, I'll say something else. You know, this will bring down the edifice. You keep on saying the sky is the limit and so on, but we have a ceiling. We have a ceiling. We have to work within this, you know, this is not going to work. And again, Gharbeya tells him, yes, we want to bring down the edifice. This is why it is a revolution. And I think the most significant thing, which is what Ala said yesterday, is imagination. What we're seeing is a new generation with a new imagination, with new tactics, with new vocabulary, with new horizons, and an unshakable sense of self-dignity and self-confidence. And I think this is why I am an optimist, and this is why I keep on learning from these kids, and this is why I'm humbled by everything I see in Tahrir and elsewhere.
Thank you very much. Professor Walden?
We're talking about the freedom of information law, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Professor Walden Bello?
Yes. Yes. First of all, I would just like to immediately follow your comment by saying that please don't feel too bad, because 26 years after the restoration of democracy in the Philippines, we're still trying to pass the Freedom of Information Act.
We haven't passed it.
We have,
but we're very close.
So, so this is. I actually am very happy to be here. I came here immediately after that exciting and awful process with all the bombast and vote buying called the Philippine elections. And I was so just happy to get out and be with you and not to share the dirty side of Philippine politics, which you know, it's in 26th year of being a democracy at one level. But I was very happy to be here because I've been involved for over a decade in support work around the Palestinian issue and other things that binds us together in an international solidarity with each other, and which makes people like me from outside the region really, we have a stake in the triumph of the democratic revolution in the Arab world, because unless it triumphs, we're, you know, the world will be much less complete in terms of the aspirations and ideals that we all fight for. Just a few points that I would like to mention. After the discussion yesterday on the IMF and Egypt and the loans from Libya, I realized that probably there isn't a Chinese wall between the political and the economic revolution that many had assumed was something that was operating in terms of the recent developments in this country, because the problem isn't really the IMF. The problem is really the IMF. It's really the sort of mentality of neoliberalism that would be accompanying all these different groups that would be offering loans to Egypt. And you can just see that it's going to be the same old prescriptions of export-oriented growth, okay? The kind of globalized growth, the kind of austerity programs, and basically the lack of a breakout from the neoliberal regime that would be accompanying the kind of economic prescriptions that they would have, which means then that I think it would be very important not just to focus on political democracy, on the formal forms of political democracy, but also already to think about alternative economic paradigms. Because unless we have those alternative economic paradigms, then yes, the process of democratization in the region could become really suffocated in the same way that it was in Latin America and in other parts of the world after the anti-dictatorship struggles in these countries. So, so I would, that's the first point that I would really want to make. The second thing is okay, the issue
Can
of...
I say just a word before? Rashid, you belong with us. Thank you for your contribution.
The second thing that I would just like to say is, for those of us from outside who are very much involved with you, we look to you for, illumination when it comes to the hard issues. And the hard issues are, at this point in time, the issues involving intervention. The intervention that took place in Libya, the intervention that is taking place in Syria at this point in time. And one of my disappointments about the conference is that I did not get a clear indication of, what we should be doing when it comes to these two areas. It almost like there was, it seemed like there was a discomfort when we talked about these issues. And yet, we outside had to be forced to take issues. We landed with certain political perspectives, given our values, and I was hoping that this would also be a conference that would give me some reinforcement in terms of the choices that we made. The third thing that I would just like to say is what Professor Khalidi had talked about the petromonarchies and about how basically we had a class of people who feel that they can get away with anything, they're above the law. And the reason that that resonates with me and how it's very important that we address that part of the Arab world is for a number of perspectives, the energy and everything else, but also the fact that we do have these massive numbers of migrants, both from the Arab world as well as from outside South Asia and Southeast Asia. I think that this is a system of unfree labor. I mean, it's a gulag type of situation. And the Arab Revolution must be able to give hope to these people. And this is why I was pushing the envelope with Ray earlier about, maybe we really ought to not accept the fact that the kafala system is there to stay, Maybe one of the things that we really need to be moving at this point is, whether in Lebanon and elsewhere, is to get rid of this system, which is really a system of servitude. I can understand if that system is still in place in Saudi Arabia, since after all it's only in 1962 that Saudi Arabia got rid of slavery, but certainly in places like Lebanon, it's untenable that it should remain. So yes, I think that this Chinese wall between the domestic population and the foreign workers, I think this is one of the things that must come down with the Arab Revolution. So the last point is civil society NGOization. I listened to the fascinating discussions here. And all I can say is that it really depends on the situation. Sometimes civil society and NGOs are a very great asset. Certainly, when we were fighting Marcos and there was no space at all for political movements, NGOs and civil society organizations were like, you know, those bamboo shoots. You know, you're underwater, but you could breathe through them because the dictatorship just came down on anything political. So at that point in time, NGOs and civil society were really a form of the ways we could get political protests up. But at other times, as we saw very clearly from the interventions on Israel by our friends on Palestine, is they can become an obstacle to you know, a more comprehensive kind of political mobilization. So with that, I would like to thank everybody here for giving me this opportunity to be really able to participate in this experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
What to say? Rashid cleverly moved the responsibility of explaining these events, revolutions, and then he left. To the social scientists, and then he left. I think that actually historians have incredibly significant role in explaining, characterizing the current events, because social scientists, I think myself being one of them, by and large look at the present. And look at the present and see at times in this present there's something unique, right? Something new, something. But when you locate it historically, then one would understand the nuances of what is happening. And I think really I do emphasize that they have a great place, very significant places in characterizing and explaining. I think the other methodology would be really comparative. In what way our revolutions that we have had here are different, civil are, and so on and so forth. And from this perspective, we can learn quite significantly. But just going back to the theme of the conference, the role of civil society, I can only repeat what I said at the end of my presentation, that I think civil society still does matter, despite the fact that a lot of criticism have been leveled against it and so on. But of course, the question then is what kind of civil society, right? What perception of civil society? That's extremely important. In this respect, I do want to again emphasize that the kind of mere or sole or exclusive preoccupation with a civil society organization or civil society activism can also be problematic, because it can avert really our attention from the type of, I think, fascinating, important activism that is going on, in particular in our societies, right? And which are extremely significant in bringing about, I think, positive social change. And so we won't pay attention to them, right? And then I tried to say, well, in what way it is possible really to connect a link between civil society activism and this type of activism. So then the question is, what is the role of organization like Asfari Foundation? In many sort of donor agencies, when I talk about non-movements and so on, they ask me, so what do we do? How do we help them, right? Because it is easy to go to an NGO because it has a building, it is people, you see them, and you basically deal with them, right? But in non-movements, what do we do? You tell us, what do we do? Or even the social movements, how do we actually connect with social movements? All I can say is that I don't know. I think I would then move this responsibility to you. Then you've got to find out, right, in what way you can connect, right, in what way you can contribute. But the important things, the first thing is that to understand that these things are important, right? The form of activism, the form of non-organized, in a sense, activities that are going on is significant. First, to understand its importance, and then feel in some way the necessity, if you want to help. I think if one think about finding a method of connecting with them, that's possible. But it shouldn't be excused that because we don't know how to connect them, then basically you ignore them. Thank you.
Thank you everyone. Let me say just very briefly a couple of words about the things that were indeed more or less missing, or we didn't focus enough on them in this conference, but then say more about the things that we learned, and I think we learned quite a bit. I personally did. I think it's, we didn't cover not just Syria, but the whole looming threat of increasing violence and how to handle violence as we move forward. This is certainly one of the biggest problems. It's obviously not an issue that one can deal with. By the way, we had this conference, there was a soft by invitation to this conference. And the purpose was, we wanted people who would come and who would feel free debating difficult questions. I mean, I think we did to some extent. But debating difficult questions, including the question of Syria, which is not as easy to discuss in the public sphere around us, and people are immediately polarized when they talk about it. I hope we'll be able to, we have to find a way, as Dr. Abdul Hayy Sayyid very passionately highlighted yesterday, we have to find a way to discuss these huge challenges that face us everywhere. This is something that we need to work on more. It wasn't covered enough in our panel, and I agree with this point. Of course, we didn't cover Islam. That's another, we talked a little bit about Islam. Islah made, I think, but very briefly, a very, very important point. People quite often, when they talk about, and I'll use Tahrir because Tahrir is the model. When they talk about Tahrir, they say it was not ideological. They say, there was no crude ideologies which were deployed. It's a spontaneous movement, which is to a great extent true. At least it reflects part of the truth. People rightly note that the Islamists were not involved in preparing the revolution. It's one thing to say there was no crude Arab nationalism which led, but it's wrong to say that there was no national consciousness. Otherwise, how do you explain the fact that it's happening in Tunis and in Egypt and in Syria and in Libya and so on and so forth? I mean, how come, and in Yemen and forgive me if I forgot something, I mean, and Bahrain and there is more to come. Of course, Marxism, there was no crude ideological Marxism responsible for the organization, but there was social justice. There was a demand of equity. There was a demand, it was there, it was present. There was no Islamism, but there were mumarasat Islamiyya, one could say. There was some sort of normative, which was present amongst other things, part of the mix, and it's part of the landscape that represents. And these are issues that we didn't discuss here. We can't discuss everything immediately. This means that we have many more things to discuss in the future. Let me now move to the issues that I think we learned in this conference. Rashid said very modestly that he doesn't belong here. I think that he actually did belong with us because he provided us with a perspective, with a historical perspective, as many of the historians and even social scientists did who are not actual activists. I mean, the big lesson one of the big lessons that we learned, and I think that set the stage for the discussion that continued pretty much today. But yesterday, one of the big, we were compelled to think about the limitations of civil society and the concept of civil society and the possibilities of civil society. The need to talk about civil society and to conceptualize civil society in a particular historical, social, political context. The notion that civil society is not immune to politics. It could easily be co-opted, and we have many, many examples, and we saw perfect examples. We saw the charts that Aslah. I mean, this is probably an extreme case, but it could be the fate of many other civil society organizations elsewhere. I think the point here is it's important for civil society organizations to be aware, to be conscious of their limitations, because without such consciousness, I mean, we scholars do that when no one can write the history of everything. And when we are advising our students, say, it's okay, you can't write a dissertation about everything, but you have to define your scope and make sure that you develop the appropriate methodology for that scope. It's okay that civil society organizations can't handle all the issues and are not responsible for all the political complications and so on and so forth, as long as they're aware what is it that they're doing and what is it that they want to reach. But we also saw, and we saw examples today, examples of the courage and the struggle of some civil society organizations, or whatever you want to call them, members of these societies. I mean, there is no doubt there are many, many manifestations, sometimes manipulated, sometimes misled or whatever, but there are numerous manifestations, and they moved us. They moved every one of us in this room. Manifestations of the courage of these members of our societies. And through what Karima described, through what Ala and Atyaf and what Al-Muqata'a and so on embody, through the examples that we looked at yesterday in terms of the legal practices and the attempts to introduce legal practices, we've actually seen numerous examples of the possibilities of civil society that have not at least been co-opted and in fact have subverted and undermined different forms of oppression and injustice. Let me just talk very, very briefly about this whole question of transitional justice. I'm not going to talk about it to the extent that it was discussed, but I want to raise, yesterday in the discussions, the point was made, and I think it's a very, very valid point, that some forums of transitional justice are actually forums that are used by the state, by the authorities to justify themselves. However, what we have in these forms also, the other side of this argument is that what we have in these forms of, the commission in Morocco, for example, I'm very critical of that commission and the role that it actually has played. But there is a fact about that commission in retrospect. This is, in Arabic, allow me for saying it and then I'll translate it. It's a sultawiyya. It's a form of authoritarianism that have opened the files of its authoritarian practices to the public. And that is a reality. That is an opportunity, if appropriately used and dealt with. To dismiss it as a simple attempt by the authority to co-opt, I think is not right. It can be co-opted, it can be misused. If there is no clear consciousness, if there isn't the larger political consciousness, it will and it can be co-opted. But it can also open a gate. It can open a door, and we should recognize that. I think what we need to be aware of is civil society organizations, us as members of civil society organizations, to the extent that we are, there needs to be an awareness of the large social and political and economic objectives of the struggle of our societies. These include equity, equality, distribution of wealth, dignity, I mean, you name it, enshrining the rights, not just recognizing people's rights, but also enshrining these rights in ways that are resilient and that makes, you know, in laws, in constitutions, there are struggles over laws and constitutions, so there are, you know, legal implications, but also this goes beyond legality into economic justice, into justice as development, and so on and so forth. But justice is at the heart. Justice in its so many different formats, and not just as a lip service or a recognition. But there is no absolute justice, and justice is never a completed project. And I think this is one way of, you know, rethinking about the whole issue of civil society and limitation. Yes, civil society has its limitations. Political parties have their limitations. Unions have their limitations. Nothing doesn't have its limitation. Everything has its limitation. The awareness of this limitation, awareness that justice is always a project in the making, it's a process, it's never an end that could be achieved. It means that we could actually reduce justice. And a struggle could contribute to the reduction of justice. And if we recognize that, I think we can recognize the possibility for a civil society. But I think there is always the danger of co-optation. There is always the danger of manipulation. And there are numerous, I think there are more civil society organizations that are manipulated than there are civil society organizations that are doing the right thing. And there is concerted effort to do that with civil society organizations. But we have to, and I think this is the lesson of the last 2 years. This region has agency. The people, there is agency in this region. So yes, there is the possibility of manipulation and co-optation, but we can also contribute to setting the agenda. We're not dopes, you know, that are manipulated left and right by people. We can actually contribute to setting the agenda, especially if we are aware of the limitations around us and the constraints around us and the limitations. And I think through this agency, we can contribute to setting the agenda. We can learn maharat al-indibat. I think Khaled, you used that. You know, we could infuse the honest, decent attempts, whatever small or big they are, we can infuse them with more and more awareness and consciousness. And in that case, civil society could be itself an act of struggle. You know, civil society organizations could be acts of struggle. So I will thank you so much. There is more that we will do. One thing that we will try to do pretty fast, and this is addressed to the participants in the conference, we want to publish the proceedings so that people could use them. We will also try to translate them, so we'll try to publish them in Arabic and in English. So please, if you have your papers ready, send them. If you don't, please write them and send them. We will be communicating with you on this, but this is a promise that we've made, which is to share the information that we have here, to share it as much as we can. You know, there is no single organization, there is no single institution, there is no single outlet that will do everything, but we need to be part of a network. And we want to be part of a network so that we could make, you know, we could make our share of contribution. Thank you all for everything.
I will open the floor now for questions, and I would really prefer people who haven't talked before, or people who really haven't contributed so far, and then we can move to others. Yes.
My name is Masa. I'm Masa Mufti from Syria, relocated to Beirut today for obvious reasons. My question, I'm not sure if I can formulate it right, articulate it in a very sophisticated way, but let me say that I have detected some gaps in trying to make sense of what citizenship, civil society is, and activism. In fact, I was very happy today to listen to Dr. Asef today, because I myself, as a Syrian who was dying and longing to be activist in Syria, could not take that step, because human relief in itself is a political act, which can be contested in a country where you don't know how to actually become an activist. So listening to Dr. Asef was enlightening, because you can actually theorize what activism is about. And truly, all the presentation have been really focusing on youth and women and the street and everything. But in fact, activism, if we want to address civil society, is not only these groups. Activism is the bourgeoisie who still hasn't done anything. And yet, it's for many various reasons, out of fear, I would say, first of all. But if we want to appeal to the civil society, and we want to really make out of activism a wide range of initiatives and contribution, we should not, by the mere fact of being consumed so much by what's happening today in the street, to focus only on the youth. Yes, give them credit, empower them, just do all of this. But there are other groups who are very much part of the civil society who has not emerged yet for mere reasons of fear, or probably choices, or other consideration, and they are part of the civil society. So I would like to say that there are many groups that haven't been tackled, like the bourgeoisie, and I think in our society, and I'm talking about Syria, for example, there's a social friction today. Those who chose to be on the street are the ones who have nothing to fear, are the poor, the lower middle class, or the young people. Yes, they have taken risks and they are paying high prices. But what about the others who wanted to be activists, who want to make a difference, and yet who do not yet find the way to be active citizens and part of the civil society? So.
Again, about Syria, and thank you, Dr. Dallal, for raising the issue that Syria was a bit missing. And I, being in contact with activists, I'm not an activist myself. Can I convey the sense of disappointment of activists within Syria? The sense that international civil society, I don't know what I should call it, has failed the movement. The view that Syria is only looked at from the prism of the issues of foreign intervention is something that is particularly reductionist of what is happening in Syria. The refusal to accept and engage with the fact that these are just ordinary citizens who live in hardship and who just deserve a better life, dignity and freedom, as they have always framed it. The ability to participate in their own affairs. These are things that have not been sensed, I think, and there is a sense of failure. And the question would be how should we engage with these people? How should we engage with people who do not want foreign intervention, and there are a lot. Who just want something else. There is a feeling that Syrian activists are feeling a bit orphaned, and now are becoming victims and of dependency to petrodollars and to grand regional designs. And this is a particularly acute issue and an acute feeling. Thank you.
My name is Selim Deligil. I'm from Istanbul, Turkey. And one of my hats is I'm a sort of resident Turk, and I'm also a historian. And one of the great missing parts of this conference was nobody ever mentioned Turkey. In fact, this seems to be a repetitive cycle here. A month ago, there was another conference here, less than a month ago, a very good one. Again, nobody mentioned Turkey. I hate to be in this awfully boring position of saying, me too, but I really do feel that if in the future, you don't have to like us, for God's sake, but we live in the region, all right? So I think that in the future, if we perhaps include that, the northern, as it were, aspect, we might, we might make a contribution. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, in the back.
Lana Khaled from the Syrian League for Citizenship, one of the structures, and a researcher too. My question is, how can academia actually help the civil society? Sitting and listening here, I'm afraid actually that it's so disengaged from what's actually happening on the ground. A lot of really great analysis of why the civil society is here, what happened, but what about the future? What kind of advice can academia help? What's the role of civil society in the future? Speaking of Syrian different groups on the ground, it was mobilized, it went on the streets, had a lot of creative input there, but what next? Do they go into political group, into advocacy, into, I would like to see more what kind of advice can academia give here, and how it can help.
Do you think it's the role of academia to give advice to activists? You think so?
Okay.
I'm asking you.
No. But actually what I've been seeing, there's been kind of a division from what's being written, from what's being said and what's being acted on the ground. Have we really looked into the local councils? How are they operating? What's happening there? Identity, the question of identity too. There are a lot of issues that we can go deeper into. Of course, the analysis is very important for why we got here, but what's next?
I want to subscribe a great deal to what Ahmad finished with in terms of kind of understanding of that what's happened really in the last 2 years, 2.5 years now almost, of what's called the Arab Spring is that there's been a loud, clear call by civil society in all of its manifestations in the Arab region for social justice, for equity, for access, for participation, for a demand that we cannot accept authoritarianism in its unaccountable forms anymore, that we have to do something else. Now, what is the something else is the million-dollar question over the next 50 or more years. But I think what is made clear is that once the street has found its voice, if we can say that, it has to figure out what it wants to say. And I think this is where there is a role for academia to help understand, to help analyze, to help consider the various things. But it requires embracing civil society in all of its manifestations, in all of its limitations, as Ahmad said. And to avoid these kinds of prescriptive theorizing about this should and this should not, and this is good and this is bad, and trying to kind of use that kind of research as a way to kind of build interesting theories in an ivory tower. I think we need to, as was said, be much closer to the street and understand it in its full diversity and its full complexities and in all of its nuances. What Islah pointed to in terms of some of the issues where NGOs can fall victim to manipulation and control, also means that on the other side, some NGOs and some activists have completely rejected all of that and have nothing to do with all of that and are pursuing other models. And they are both civil society. They are both active and they're both working in the same goals, including working in direct relationship, in reforms, in legal advocacy, and whatever. And I think that presents a very rich menu for research for the Institute, the Asfari Institute, as it proceeds. And I think that openness is crucial.
Well, it probably makes sense to, my name is Tarek from English, and just taking on what my friend Salim mentioned regarding Turkey. Listening, I've been popping in and out of this conference, as indeed many of the other conferences we bump into in here. One of the fundamental things that comes across to me, it's almost like the beans in the pan are trying to work out why they're so hot. They just can't understand that the person lighting the fire is the same. Yes, indeed, from Kashmir right the way to here, that the Arab world does not exist in isolation to our world. You can't understand anything to do with activism if we live inside a pan. We are held together by a series of common bondages. Some of those are coming undone. It's in the retrenching of yesterday's imperial powers from Afghanistan right the way through here, and it's their needs as well, and as much as the needs of our movements. The two things cannot be separated. There is a retrenchment going off of those who have pillaged and plundered us right the way from here. Just look from here to the Afghan border, to the Chinese border. There's hardly a building left standing, metaphorically speaking, in a sense. And in that sense, any institute that emerges should not only look at that which is within itself, but also those that are of our enemies. We can't simply be studying Islamic movements, when never a word is mentioned about the Jewish movements, about the Christian movements, and the Hindu movements, and by God they are linked. The world's greatest paramilitary organizations are not Islamic, they are Hindu. No, and they are in political power, they have been in political power. This is not to promote sectarianism, but to come to a thing that any institute that emerges, and I think the issue what Salim raises is of paramount importance. This is an imperial power that suddenly withdrew, left the region without any form of an infrastructure, just because you can now make a few fridges, Salim. That means that you denied the historical developments to somewhere else. So my final point really is that there is no way to understand any form of activism, because these are the very debates taking place on the question of the occupation of Afghanistan. Should the NGOs be going down and providing DNA so the Americans can go bang in Aqaba, or should something else be developing? That something else is probably the most important question of getting ourselves out of the yoke that holds us together. And I don't think it's complicated. I mean, it doesn't start and end on Kashmir.
I want to follow up on the point that Walden was saying about the perhaps somewhat understated focus on the issues of war and intervention. I mean, I think, when you're putting together a conference, everything is limited. But I want to just actually throw the ball over to Atef Al-Wazir, because the first time we met, she was talking about anti-drone activism going on in Yemen, and anyone who watched President Obama's speech yesterday, the second only national security speech he's given the entire time he's been in office, and he said less American boots on the ground, but an increase in targeted precision strikes, meaning drone strikes in Yemen is ground zero. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about anti-drone activism.
In Yemen, we started to talk about this about 2.5 years ago, if not more, but many of the human rights community, the NGOs, were afraid to talk about this because it's a big red line and it's too sensitive, and also they're receiving funding from many of the US donor agencies, so they really couldn't discuss this. And recently there's been a lot more civilian casualties, a lot more people documenting this. One of the missile, for example, the US missile attack killed 40 civilians, women and children, and it was reported as Al-Qaeda, of course, and nobody. And the journalist who covered this specific act has been in prison since then. When the former president gave an amnesty to all political detainees, President Obama called specifically our former president and said, "I'm not comfortable with this," and he still remains in jail till this day. I mean, the movement, I think, has gained ground a bit in Yemen. More people are able to speak about this. We've organized mass protests. We've went to different places, and there are 9 governorates that had drone attacks, not just one area, unlike Pakistan. And the most importantly, I think, is this global sort of solidarity. We had more activists from outside Yemen supporting us than inside the country. People didn't want to talk about, at first, they didn't want to talk about Qaeda. It was too sensitive, and we don't like these crazy people anyways. Maybe they should be killed. That was the initial idea in the beginning. Now more people are affected by it, so they recognize that it's not just, anyway, so I think the most important part of this is this global solidarity. And it's really, really important, and I think that's something we can build on what all of you guys had said, and it ties back to what I was going to ask here. I've been away from Yemen for about a month now in Berlin, and it's been really interesting because it was the first time I can take a step back, I think in a long time, take a step back from being inside the country. And no phone calls, no meetings, and I was able to actually look at the situation in a different way. And I think that's the luxury many academics have, that they're always analyzing things from maybe a different perspective. And I don't think it's either the street or academia. I think both are needed. Civil society, academia, everyone has a role to play. And my question then is, how can, the question was, how can Asfari, my question was, how can you help in that, building that kind of relationship between either the global solidarity or this, parallel between the street and academia?
I'll just give
on these two questions, how can academia help civil society? I mean, of course, there isn't a single way, and it depends on the proclivities and the whatever we want to do. But I would like to call on Bassam Haddad as one example of how academia can actually provide. Bassam, tafadhal. But Bassam, to speak about Jadaliya, which is a forum that many of you know, which is a forum which really goes beyond academia and plays a very important role as a forum for awareness, for discussion, for so many different things, and there are many other projects. This is only one example, and as you probably know, Bassam and Jadaliya and the Arab Studies Institute are partners with us, and we are very happy to partner with them. This is only one example. There are many, there are endless examples. And of course, there are many more academics who are just doing their work and not interested in anything else, unfortunately. But there are some who do other things. The same purpose.
I don't think there is, or there should be, a separation between academia and activism and things of the sort. I think this whole notion of separation and division of labor is a market feature of what I view as liberal ideology or liberalism that tries to distinguish and separate and differentiate in order for things to remain the same. So people don't end up actually engage in society in ways that are organic, and they only engage through specialized mechanisms, which actually ends up, even if you're trying to be radical or trying to resist, it ends up actually reproducing existing power relations. So one of the things we're trying to do at what is called the Arab Studies Institute, which is actually an umbrella organization for several organizations, is to blur the lines between all of these things. And what we're trying to do at Jadaliya, which is actually the result of the effort of several dozen individuals with a core team. Some of them are here, including Lisa Hajjar and Samir Rasui and others. What we're trying to do is actually present a forum that actively blurs these lines, not in terms of academia and activism and opinion and so on, but also in terms of how we present the material. If you go to that site, for instance, we do not distinguish between professors and PhDs and graduate students, or even undergrads who sometimes write better pieces than others. We don't distinguish between activists who are writing and non-activists, between opinion pages, which I think is a very problematic designation. You see a section in the New York Times or any other publication that says opinion, as opposed to the other thing, which is supposed to be, I don't know, neutral, truth, and munzal, I don't know. So it's one of the things that in what we do in action, not just in words, represent the blurring of these lines. The only other thing I want to say is that besides, people can go to ArabStudiesInstitute.org and learn more about all of the projects we're actually embarking on. And there are many projects. It's a huge team right now worldwide, mostly voluntary based, so it's actually non-hierarchical. It's based on a conception of participation whereby you own what you participate in rather than come in and do work for others or for another entity and leave. So you can take a look at that at your leisure. The one thing I want to say, listening to all of this, first of all, I think this institute has the potential to do something extremely new for a couple of reasons. First, it's the first major institute that arises in an academic environment with this kind of academic and non-academic mission, and after the uprisings. And the issue here is that the uprisings, and I support Atyaf al-Wazir's use of the word imagination. This is something that I think is far deeper, far more important than all other kinds of things that can be focused on as a dimension to think about. We need to reimagine even words such as civil society and things of the sort. We need to reimagine what these mean in the context of what's happening today. I think also we need to reimagine what Islamic politics might mean, what liberal politics is, what secularism is, what left is. I mean, Jesus. Okay, Khaled. I mean, the word left, yasar. I mean, when in yasar, where's the left today? What does the left mean anymore in terms of politically, socially, economically, and so on. So I really feel that this moment is a fantastic moment to blur the lines and to actually advance, I don't want to say radical, but to advance challenging conceptions of things, because the readiness we all have today, is something that might not come back for many decades to come if we don't take advantage of it. So this is the time actually to not worry about conservative shackles, and this is the time to push the envelope. And those people who would like to preserve things, let's tell them that what you've been trying to preserve for decades is what kept us there. So it is okay to be risky. It is okay to do the work that our friend here is doing. I forget the name. Nader, and many of us here, so I really think it is time to begin blurring these lines in practice and not worry one single bit about what we might be trampling upon in terms of cherished and preserved values, because these values have not done very much for us so far. I'm sorry if I sounded preachy, sorry if I embarrassed you, Ahmad, but that's all I wanted to say.
Question, and since I am an academic who has been active, I think I can share with you just one thing, is that, you know, as I said, I write this weekly. It's the one thing that I've been doing consistently since the revolution started. It's much better than my teaching or anything else. It's just this weekly article that I've been writing, and I noticed that the better articles are the ones in which I use my knowledge as a historian to make sense of what is happening. These are the articles that I get the best feedback about and encouragement on. So, but then I think one of the things that in terms of academia and activism, I think, as I was trying to say yesterday, is that we also have to resist that. We have to resist that temptation of being as academics, people who kind of know it all, who can authorize what is happening on the street, who can articulate it better than what people on the street are doing or activists are doing. As I tried to say, I think the most eloquent thing that I heard was this gesture by this young man about and his look in his eye about what he feels Al-Dakhliya represents, and that, you know, so it's humbling. So I think, and in my work on this freedom of information law, these people have, you know, things to teach me infinitely more than I can tell them. So okay, you know, we draft things and so on, but then they come and anticipate, you know, 2 steps ahead. They say, no, this language will put us into this problem. We know, we've dealt with it. So if you think you've done your homework by studying the freedom of information law and its history and where it comes from and so on, let us tell you that it won't work the way you think it will. This phraseology will end us with, you know. So I think we have to actually, you know, listen also from activists and engage with them constantly. And as Bassam is saying, you know, the line needs to be blurred somehow. And finally, to recognize that as historians or as social scientists, what we are confronted with is something unprecedented. And that it seems that our tools of analysis and the terms we use to make sense of what is happening itself may be outdated. and unsuitable. So we cannot come and say, you know, we've got it out, you know, clearly. I think sometimes, yes, but then there has to be some recognition that this is unprecedented and that we have to learn a new language.
Rochelle Davis, Georgetown University, and thank you everyone for stimulating 2 days of conversations and ideas, and also very inspiring ones as well. I wanted to, as someone who stands outside and sort of watches and participates in various ways in things that go on in the Arab world, I wanted to kind of think, sort of encourage us to think more about what Walden Bello said about the neoliberal agenda. And as it sort of has spread throughout the globe, that it's not just sort of a large economic one invested in those institutions, but that it's also cultural, and that it's ways that we somehow think that outsiders both have the right to say what people should be doing and that they somehow know better. And I think many of the presentations today, Islah's and Nader and Dial's and many of the other ones, kind of pointed at points of resistance to those ideas. And I know in Islah's case, in Palestine, there are many people who sort of will not cooperate with USAID. I mean, will not take money from them, will not in any sorts of ways, at the same time that others do. And so there's these kind of divergent ways of both boycotting and sort of the encouragement to boycott Israeli products and buy Palestinian products has been something that started with the first Intifada, but it just doesn't really happen on the ground. I mean, stores continue to stock their shelves with Israeli products, and these sort of ideas that things that come from outside are better is a sort of a form of this cultural neoliberalism and as well as sort of economic. And I think we need to tie those things together and see them more holistically and not so sort of separate.
Hi, I'm Alexis Wick from the History Department at AUB. I want to first share in thanking the organizers and the panelists and the contributions that have been illuminating in more ways than one. And I want to thank Tariq and Lisa for bringing out the issue of imperialism and neo-imperialism connected to the neoliberalism that my predecessor spoke about, because I think it's absolutely essential to these discussions, and one that has remained somewhat in the background for both explicit and implicit reasons, I think. And so it took the wind out of my sails, but I thank them for their very acute comments. And so I will limit my comment to a question to Khaled Fahmy, and I wonder whether you can clarify why you connected Islam with identity. And you said that you usually see them as being together, or lump them together. And whether you can clarify that, and whether civil society, therefore, is not about identity and secular, or I wasn't sure what the implications of what you said, or even what the meaning of what you said was. So I just wanted a clarification. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to raise 3 points. The first point, I want to react to a very important point raised by Dr. Ahmad concerning violence. And here I will go back to the first Palestinian uprising. I think the lesson learned from this uprising should be thought of very carefully, because the strongest army in the region was helpless in front of tens of thousands of people in the street. That's why the Palestinian Authority came after that. The Palestinian Authority came in 1994, just at the end of the Palestinian uprising. Why I'm saying this? I'm saying this because I want to refer to the genius word by the Egyptian people when they said millioniyat. Millioniyat, or organize a demonstration of 1 million people, it means a very simple equation that people's power can neutralize the mighty power in the world. the mighty power in the world can kill some people. They cannot kill all the people. And this is a very important lesson we need to learn from the Egyptian, I don't want to call it revolution till now, and also from the Palestinian uprising. When I look around and I look at cases that violence have been used, the end was miserable, and the end does not help the region to stand on its feet. This is something, I want to also refer to some people who are saying about the intervention of the NATO. NATO cannot support the revolutions. We should not be misled by that. If people are not ready to pay the price, well, so the moment is not right. Another moment will be better. But we should never call for an intervention to help any revolutionary act in our region. This is number one. Number two, concerning the new liberal culture. Yes, I agree with Rachel about the new liberal culture, but also I should add to that the role of the Palestinian Authority itself. Many advertisement companies are run by relatives of people in the Palestinian Authority, and they were the first to market and do publicity about Israeli goods. So it's not, maybe in some few centers of city, it's about, consumerism and all of that. But for the rest, it is the role of the Palestinian Authority itself that is not willing, because there are so many sub-agents and agents for Israeli product in the region. My third point is related to Islamic movements. I have no problem with the identity politics, but I have a problem to deal with some political groups came to power and they should be, questioned about their economic, social, culture programs, and we insist to deal with them based on identity politics. This is something we have also to think about it. Thank you.
One thing I wanted to address is the fact that maybe what this conference is missing is a recognition that this so-called Arab world is not completely Arab. I briefly touched on this in my discussion, but if you go to Algeria or Morocco, a large part of these societies is Amazigh. Even Tunisia, Algeria, or Siwa in Egypt. Also, when we say the Arab Spring, I find this term to be very problematic. It's actually rejected by the great majority of the February 20th movement because it excludes Amazighs, it excludes Kurds, it excludes Turks who are also living in this region. So perhaps in the future it would be great to see the inclusion of these the diversity of the region in this conference, and also perhaps I am here. You didn't know I was Amazigh when you invited me. And another thing is another thing is the Western Sahara is also a very important, and maybe if this was put on YouTube I might get in trouble for saying this, but the Western Sahara is also a very important aspect of this region that isn't talked about. It's usually it's included in discussions about Morocco, and maybe we need to talk about it a little bit separately because it deserves that recognition. Recently, the Western Sahara has been getting not enough global attention, and these people they want their rights, and I think they also deserve a chance to speak about them. So just for future considerations. Thank you, Greg.
2 points. First to Khaled, I would say what is absent here, not the Islam and the identity, but the voice of Islamism. Why we don't bring them here instead just talk about them, the present absent, and Muhsin Saleh, for instance, who has a think tank called Zaytuna. Is he Islamist? I mean, what is the difference between Muhsin Saleh and Azmi Bshara in his think tank in Qatar and Markaz Dirasat al-Wahda al-Arabiyya, who is here? I mean, all they have ideologies. I am a member of the research committee of Center of Arabic Unity Studies. I mean, I know, I can, what is the difference between them? I mean, I appreciate so much Abdel Hamid when he said there is a lot of fundamentalism that go beyond just the Islamists. And I think let them bring them here and talk with them. And I think this is, if there is a big message of Arab Springs or the region Springs for Nader, is very important. I am not sarcastic here. Is really that we should not be a bubble. I mean, as a leftist, and we should intermingle a little bit with others. This is my first, the second and last point. Yes, the last one is to follow up in the debate about academia versus other. And I disagree with you, Omar. I mean, what is going on now in Arab world is an aberration of the history of social science.
Do you disagree with what? Sorry.
No, I disagree with you when you told her that why we should.
No. I asked her the question if she thought that. I wasn't really putting a judgment. I was asking her if she thought that academia should tell academics what to do.
Yeah, just I wanted to say that what is going on with the commodification of knowledge is an aberration. I mean, the history. I talk about my discipline, sociology. The history of sociology is a history of really the public sociology is so closely connected to the professional sociology. And actually, what is going on in Lebanon, in spite of amazing regulations sent by our Provost, Ahmad Dallal, we should look to the quality and the impact of our publications as faculty. The practice until today at AUB is to look to the impact factors and citation index. And without looking citation by who should cite us? Okay? Is it important that somebody from Lebanon to cite us or somebody, I don't know. So I think really, and I am praising, really. I'm not sarcastic. I found that is a huge discrepancy between a goodwill of, in the last 5 years at AUB, really to encourage us, faculty, to be civically engaged and to do public research, but the practice, and I have very evidence, and my dean is here, he can witness some discussions in some closed area, that is absolutely, it's counting, and people don't dare to show that they published in a newspaper. So I think it's an aberration, and in fact, we can converse with you without any hierarchy and learn a lot from you, and you learn a lot from us. Thank you.
Okay. اليوم عرفت مساوئ أن يكون رئيس الإرادة لأن تضطهد صار نص ساعة أقول الكلام متخلي.
عندي سرعة.
قبل استمر كل الآن على أي حال. عندي بس تجربة أشارككم بها قبلها من الأكاديمية بمنظمات المجتمع المدني. ب 2006 مجموعة أكاديميين فكرنا نأسس مركز دراسات نسوي. والغريب إن كلنا أكاديميين وأكاديميات. كان هذا غريب بالنسبة لأن المجتمع المدني أو المنظمات تشتغل على قضايا أخرى. الجامعة ما كان هذه المواضيع مطروقة عندنا يعني في الجامعة العراقية، في قطيعة هي كل ما يتعلق بالجندر، بالمرأة، حقوق الإنسان. من اجينا احنا يعني طلعنا كتاب اول سنه مراجعات في الدستور العراقي. عملنا مراجعه للدستور اللي كان مطروح وطبعا اشتغلوا عليه ولحد الان يعتبر مرجع. وأيضا بعد عام طلعنا مراجعات بالتشريعات الخاصة بالمرأة اللي كلها اجتماعية وسياسية وضمن المنظومة القوانين. ما قدرنا أكثر لأنه إحنا ما عندنا القدرة على إنه ما قدرنا نستمر بهذا المساق لأنه ما عندنا القدرة لأنه نجيب تمويل حتى نطبع هذه الكتب. وأيضا الجهات اللي كان ممكن تدعمنا كان عندها هي قصص تريد إحنا نشتغل عليها وإحنا طبعا ما قدرنا نشتغل عليها. بالتالي فشل. بس عموما إحنا هاي التجربة في أكاديميات وأكاديميين لم يكونوا قد فكروا بهذه المواضيع، كانت مهمة بالنسبة لهم يدخلون مجال هم ما كانوا باحثين فيه. وأيضا الجمعيات والمنظمات اللي كانت تشتغل على الموضوع تنبهت إلى أنه هي ممكن تشتغل على هذه المواضيع. هذا واحد. أنا أتمنى طبعا صار يوم سمعت أشياء جدا مهمة ولا شيء فاتني. من تجربتي تجربتنا بالعراق وأكيد هي متعثرة وبعدها متعثرة ستبقى على وقت ليس القليل متعثرة. مسألة الإيمج أوف يعني civil society. أنا عملت سيرفي بسيط لصورة المجتمع المدني طلاب الجامعات طبعا شيء مخيل. ما أعرف إذا احنا فينا نشوف هذا المجتمع المدني كيف يشوف المجتمع هو أصلا هو المجتمع المدني. الصورة هو شلون يشوف ذاته، يعني شلون يعرف نفسه وشلون الآخر أيضا المجتمع اللي يتعاطى أو يتعامل معه كيف يراه. أعتقد هذا يمكن إذا احنا قدرنا مثلا مجموعة باحثين أو مهتمين يشوفون يدرسون الصورة عند المجتمع مثلا في العراق في لبنان، هذه المجموعة صور أكيد راح تعطينا صورة ولو تقريبية لما يمكن أن نقوم به مستقبلا. تصحيح هذه الصورة، تعزيزها، ولو مقترح أو فكرة من تجربة بسيطة أنا كنت فيها في جامعة الغموض ما يعرفون شنو مجتمع المدني. وأول شيء قلت يعني يعني فلوس يعني تسافرون مؤتمرات.
يعطيكم العافية. حبيب بدوي طالب دكتوراه بالجامعة اللبنانية. سامحوني إذا هاجمت شوي صغيرة إنه المنظرة كانت نخبوية. يعني 85% من العالم هن عاديين. يعني مثلا باليمن وبالبحرين ما حكيوا على الدور الإيراني اللي هو واضح. إخواتنا بالعراق وبسوريا في صراع مذهبي. بالمغرب العربية منا قومية، العربية هي اللسان، يعني فيك تكون كردي، تركي، أرمني، عربي، بتحكي لغة عربية هي اللسان، منا الجنس الآلي النازي بنقول نحن عرب ومتعصبين. بمصر أنا حضرت كونفرنس بالجامعة القاهرة Shaping Ways We Teach. أكيد كان في النظر النخبوي، نزلت على الشارع معظمهم إسلاميين. فنحن إذا بدنا نعكس المجتمع بدنا نحكي عن المجتمع، مش عن اللي قاعدين بالجامعة الأمريكية في القاهرة أو بالAUB بلبنان. بدنا نحكي أكثر عن المجتمع. وعفوا إذا هاجمت شوي. Thank you.
This comment is basically to Nader. I wanted to talk earlier, but then you brought up the issue again. I'm also troubled by the idea of this Arab Amazighi identity. I think it's problematic because it raises lots of issues. Like, for example, I'm Lebanese, and some people say, I'm not Arab, I'm Phoenician. And I think it's funny because, Romans came here, Greeks came here, Turks came here, and Arabs came here as well. It happens that I'm speaking Arabic today, and it's not a problem. I mean, it's just my language. Sorry?
Can you make it short, please, because we're running out of time also.
Yeah, so I think that what you're saying raises sectarian issues, and the sectarianism, I think, is the root of all our troubles today. It's, the root of religious sectarianism, it can be linguistic sectarianism, any kind of sectarianism, I think causes lots of issues, so.
Okay, thank you. There are other people who want to speak also. Yes, Michael, actually, and then.
I'm Michael Hudson from the National University of Singapore, and I thank AUB for the invitation to attend what has been an absolutely fascinating and enlightening session on a subject very dear to my heart, the question of participation and legitimacy in the politics of the Arab world. Following the encouragement of Ahmad Dallal, I have 5 suggestions for what this institute might want to look at or think about. This is based on things I have heard here and also things I have not heard. First of all, don't reinvent the wheel. And you might want, I don't know whether you've done this, but there was quite an outpouring of literature in the social sciences on civil society in the Middle East in the late 1980s and 1990s, in which some of these terminological questions were widely debated. Second is the contagion effect. Now, we were told that it was axiomatic that what we're all talking about and reacting to is I think, a world historical experience. Well, really, is it? And I think one way to try to figure out whether it is to ask what its dimensions are, both temporally and spatially. And I am still puzzled myself as to whether we're seeing spillover, which would lead one to think this really is something massive and unusual, or whether it's really just a series of events. The third point, we heard this many times, and in many conferences in the last few days here, is the question of sectarianism. And I think I am still uncertain as to how much latitude social scientists and historians have or will allow us in deciding how much of that is embedded and how much is constructed. And clearly, as we look around the region today, you can't go anywhere. I have colleagues in Singapore who are working on Iraq and on Syria, and they say, well, it's just sectarianism, there's nothing much else. But although in Lebanon this is a very old subject, I still think it needs to be unpacked a little bit further. Fourthly, I would be really interested to see the development of longitudinal understandings of how these uprisings are unfolding. That is a kind of a morphology. Because it seems that we saw in the first phase an enthusiastic outpouring, popular from the bottom, and then things begin to unwind, unfold, change, etc. And I think that there would be much work to be done in figuring out, are there alternative trajectories, and is there something to be done about keeping oppositions together when they seem to tend to fall apart after a while. And then finally, it's been mentioned already, the question of foreign involvement. A huge debate, as we all know, on Syria. And when an uprising becomes militarized and externalized, you see the results. And I do think that this should be one of the emphases of this institute. Thank you.
I also want to add my voice to everybody else's for a really fantastic conference and for a very enriching discussion over the past 2 days. I just have a couple of comments. I'm going to pick up from where Michael left off. I've written down the issue of trajectories as one issue, just a number of issues that I think we need to be looking at more. One issue definitely is the trajectories of the uprisings, not only in terms of how they started and where they're going now, but what is becoming very clear is the way they're unfolding is also very determined by their historical and political context. The role of civil society in these different countries is also determined by the historic and political and societal context in which it is happening. For example, if I contrast Libya to Egypt to Yemen, the role of civil society is dramatically different, no matter how we define civil society or how we look at new social movements.
The other issue I'd like to bring up, and it sort of it's been coming in and out over the past couple of days, which is the relationship between the legal context in which civil society organizations, new social movements are operating, and praxis. One area, I take the Constitution of Egypt as an example, where there has been a lot of discussion that the new constitution actually nationalizes civil society organizations and places considerable restrictions on them.
and yet they are flourishing, and they're flourishing in a number of ways. So the way, I know in housing studies we talk about legal pluralisms, the idea that the way the law is set is not necessarily the way it is practiced, that people find ways of circumventing the laws. So this kind of nexus between law and practice, I think, is one that is worth looking in terms of how civil society is operating today in the region in different ways. The third issue, I think, is fundamentally important for the future of this region, which is bridging gaps. And I go back to what Abdel was talking about yesterday in Syria, where you have almost two societies that now, it's a country or a society that is almost imploding and has become divided into two distinct societies that are talking at each other rather than talking to each other. There is an accusation of mutual accusations. There is a victim and there is a victimizer, and yet both are victims. This discussion of victimhood is one that we see in Lebanon here today. Every sectarian community considers itself a victim. No one is we're all victims in this country. So I think it's important to look at what role, how do we bridge the gaps between these different conceptions of victimhood, of justice, but also of societies, of identities, and how do we, and this is where sectarianism comes in. The conflict in Syria has been increasingly characterized as a sectarian conflict. The media took it up much earlier, especially the mainstream media, much earlier. At times when I was hearing from friends who are activists on the ground saying this is not what we are about. We are asking for our rights. We are not a sectarian. This is not a sectarian uprising. So I think there is a fundamental role that we as academics, as practitioners, as in our different capacities can play in both bridging gaps, but also in undermining this kind of characterization, and really looking at to what extent, as Michael said, it is constructed and to what extent it is embedded within society. Finally, my final point is just I would urge that we look at examples in other regions. We are not the first region in the world to be going through this experience. Actually, perhaps we're the last. There is an experience, post-Franco Spain, civil society had a fantastic role to play. Argentina, anywhere we go, there are similarities with other contexts, depending on the issues that we can learn a lot from and build on. Thank you.
أنا بس بدي أحكي إنه بدي أشكر الموجودين على توفير مساحة لإنتاج الأفكار البديلة، وجزء من هيدا المساحة كانت اختيار المواضيع. يعني ما كتير بوافق مع الأشخاص اللي طالبوا بأنه لازم يكون في جلسات عن الحركات الإسلامية وإلى آخره. أنا بعتبر إنه عم بيتم الكلام عم بيتم التحدث فيها كتير، وبالعكس هيدي المواضيع اللي عم بتكون على الهامش. حابة أفتح كمان موضوع إنه إشكالية المثقف العضوي اللي حكوا عنه جرامشي، اللي هو ممكن يكون صحافي أو باحث أو فنان إلى آخره، واللي هو مرتبط عضويا بالحراك. والمثقفين العضويين كانوا شبه غائبين قبل الثورة، وما بعرف أو مهمشين، موجودين بس مهمشين، ما في أي مساحة أو مراكز أو أماكن مؤسسات تحويلهم. فهون إنه رأيي هلا الوقت المناسب لنرجع نفتح هذا النقاش ونرجع نعيد تعريف مين هو المثقف العضوي وشو دوره بالضبط. وبس هيدي كانت تعليقي. شكرا.
No, I think, and to relate to this last point about Islamists' lack of a serious economic and social program,
I see this point, but I also see that basically they have presented themselves in Egypt, especially the Salafis, as people playing on this very sensitive chord, which is identity. Time to go back to our identity, time to implement Sharia. Sharia will solve many. It's a bit more sophisticated than the Islam huwa al-hal, but not really much more. I personally decided that with the significance of your challenge, no, come and talk about economics, come and talk about social reform. I actually said, no, I actually want to discuss with them Sharia. I actually think they don't understand what Sharia is. And I decided to write a series of articles and to appear with them on TV to fight this battle with them. They're not even qualified to speak there. So, but that is what win them elections, I think. People are not It's not zit sukkar in Egypt, as people say. Egyptian voter is touched by other things, and I think the question of identity that they sell, that it's about authenticity, and that would, I mean, that is the last point that I'd like to say in response to Nader's point. I think Nader, I see your sensitivity about calling it Arab Spring, but I think what the Arab Spring, whatever you want to call it, is posing, among many other things, is a new valency for the word Arab. Whereby, and I noticed this with myself, I never, on a certain level, I never ever thought that I would carry an Egyptian flag. This is something that hooligans would do in stadiums. This is a state TV. This is ultra-nationalism. I don't do this. But in Tahrir, I found myself carrying an Egyptian flag because it meant something else. It meant not the nationalist thing that we were fed in school, but a new inclusive nationality and civil society and a country that we're struggling to achieve. And I found myself doing the same thing when I carried the Syrian flag. It is not in Tahrir. I carried the Palestinian flag and the Syrian flag and the Bahraini flag, not out of the 1960s nonsense that we were taught in school, but it is, in other words, it's something because I thought that I share a lot with what these people are doing, that I see and including the Amazigh. So, in other words, it is not the nationalism that is based on a common ancestry and a common past. It is the exact opposite. It is a nationalism or a solidarity that is based on a common future, a common dream, a common hope, different horizons. So in that sense, I really don't care what we call it, Arab Spring or Amazigh Spring or whatever it is. Doesn't matter. But I think there is a new, it's one of the things that we are challenging is the good old-fashioned nationalism that you and I are suffering from.
I think this is a great way to end.
And on this note, first of all, I'd like to conclude by thanking all the staff, the people who are holding the cameras, the volunteers, and special thanks to the two translators. Enduring with us in this very difficult bilingual kind of intervention. So, and thanks to everyone for being here. So, Ahmed, do you want to say anything?
Just to thank you all, thank our speakers, and thank our audience.
Thank you all, thank our speakers, thank our audience, thank staff, thank the cameraman, thank everyone. Thank you, and we promise more in the future.